Hi, welcome to AAPI Voice. Our guests today are Michigan State Representative Padma Kuppa and Matt Koleszar. Both representatives serve districts with high concentration of Asian Americans. Hi, Rep. Kuppa and Koleszar. Thank you both for joining us today. Before we get into questions, why don't you each take a few minutes to give us a brief overview of what you have worked on this last term, and especially during the pandemic.
So Lisa, first I'd like to say thank you so much for having me and Rep. Koleszar on your show. As you know, we represent a lot of community groups within our own district. So I represent Troy and Clawson. So I've got different stakeholders from the school district, from the city, from the business community, but also culturally. And I have a lot of Asian Americans in my district, as does Rep. Koleszar. And within the Asian community, we know that there are many different interests. There are doctors, there are engineers. Many of my former Chrysler colleagues are here in Troy and Clawson, as well as business owners. And so one of the things that we've been doing is reaching out to people over the last 18 months, reaching out to people, making sure that they know we are here as a voice for them, and also to hear what are their concerns. So we've held town halls and office hours, attended different events within the Asian American community. You know that the Indian community has a big event for Indian American Republic, the Indian Republic Day, but it's called Indian American, we did an Indian American Legislative Day. We also have had, at the governor's house, we helped organize a Diwali event as well as a Lunar New Year event. And so these are some of the things that we've done in at least that we've worked on in office, but also just general policy that supports the interests and the values that the Asian American community shares. I'm very honored that we have many teachers, but especially that we value so much our educators. And Rep. Koleszar is one of the leading charges on that front, making sure that all our children have access to education and get a quality education, because that is the backbone of a strong economy. During the pandemic, we've been working on responding to constituents who have concerns about unemployment, about the governor's executive orders. Maybe they have a lot of questions. So we've been making sure that we answer those questions as quickly as possible. Sometimes the executive order isn't as clear, but making sure that, and also raising the issue of small business. And I'm going to stop there because I want to let Rep. Koleszar talk about our Downtown Business Coalition.
Thanks, Rep. Kuppa, and thank you, Lisa. It's good to see you. Obviously, you are a constituent of mine, so it is always good to see somebody who I represent up in Lansing. So over the last 2 years, as you know, I have spent a lot of time focusing on education. Being a teacher of 12 and a half years, it's an issue that is very important to me. Access to a good public education, to me, is incredibly important, and we need to make sure that we are focusing on making sure that public school dollars stay in the public school classroom and not given to different special interests that may not have the kids' best interest at heart. During the pandemic, much like Representative Kuppa, it's been a big focus on constituents, and it's been a focus on unemployment issues. It's been a focus on the Downtown Business Coalition, which I'm glad Rep. Kuppa brought that up. So what that was, I started that, and Representative Kuppa is one of our members on it, who is also, I would say, one of the most active members on it too. And what it was is we reached out directly to small businesses to get their input. What are their struggles? What are their concerns? And what are their ideas? The whole idea being, we want to build policy to help these small businesses from the local level up and not Lansing on down. And I think that's important because so many of these issues, you know, you hear from Lansing, these very partisan issues come up, but when you talk to a business owner, they would say, I just need to figure out how to pay my rent. And that's their issue. So, and that's not a partisan issue. So I think it's been very important to get that local feedback. In addition, trying to get the legislature the ability to act during the height of the pandemic. I sponsored a bill that would allow for remote voting, which unfortunately was never taken up, but I think it would have made us a much more interactive legislature, especially when some in the legislature were complaining about the governor taking too much action. This was an option to make us more interactive, and it was not taken up. But still, having a more active legislature, reaching out to our small businesses, and then, as I know we're going to talk about a little later, so I won't get too much into it, also talking about how to reopen school in the fall.
Thank you both for informing our viewers on your work to date. Now let's talk about what is some of the more pressing issues right now. Currently, the most important issue on everybody's mind is the economy and the public health. Specifically, the safe reopening of our economy and the schools. Rep. Koleszar, since you are on the education committee and the health policy committee, why don't you go first? The first question is, what will you do to advocate for the safe reopening of our schools without creating hardship on the schools and families?
Absolutely. And first, I get so excited to talk about this, I almost didn't even let you get a question out. So I apologize for that. So I think the biggest important thing here to me is local control, but with state guidelines and state support. And what I mean by that is we as a state need to be very clear about how to keep students safe, how to keep staff and those who work in the school safe, because also everybody that's in these schools are going home to their families at the end of the day, and we want to make sure we don't spread the virus. But that being said, no two school districts are the same, and a one-size-fits-all approach is not a good idea either. But we also can't just say to local school districts, you take care of it and we're not going to tell you how. We need to make sure at the state level we are a good, solid area of support, to make sure that school districts have the resources they need, but still we give them the ability to make the decisions that they need to make for their school district, since again, no two school districts are ever the same.
I do want to add to that just a little bit, and that is that yesterday, or is it the day before? It feels like every day just runs into another. There's so much going on. Attorney General Dana Nessel and California Attorney General Xavier Becerra were leading a coalition of 6 attorneys general who are suing the U.S. Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, because the Education Secretary is trying to limit the ability of public schools to use federal funds provided under the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act. And so this is a real problem because that money is there to help our schools, and to prevent us from using it is really wrong. How will our children and our schools and our teachers get the resources they need, given that we've had 4 months of this pandemic actively affecting our economy?
What can we do to reopen the economy without creating difficult requirements or cost for businesses?
So one of the things that we discovered during the regional roundtable that we held was that a lot of people had questions that we can't solve at the state level. So we have been working with our federal level representatives advocating on these issues. In fact, we've met with both Haley Stevens, Congresswoman Stevens, as well as Congresswoman Slotkin, have been really good at reaching out and asking. I was actually on an APA roundtable discussion with Representative Congresswoman Slotkin a few weeks ago, and we are unable to do a lot of things that at the state level. However, one of the things that we did do at the state level, in addition to the Downtown Business Coalition, is the CARES Act came out with money to help small business. It was called the Paycheck Protection Program. So we've been very actively, in each of us in our own districts, have been reaching out to the small business owners and to different organizations that are sort of the first line of contact, the Chamber of Commerce, the Downtown Development Association. I know that my colleague in Royal Oak, Jim Ellison, who also has a lot of Asian American businesses in his district, has been reaching out. And so we're trying to make it accessible, because a lot of the time we don't know what government is doing. And so making sure that we are transparent and making resources available to constituents is really important to us.
One thing I think that also needs to be added here is wearing a mask. If we wear a mask, at this point, we are keeping other people healthy. We keep other people healthy. The numbers don't go back up into a dangerous level. And that means more businesses can stay open and continue to rebuild after the original COVID crisis. So I think it's very important that people still wear masks, socially distance, and try to still be responsible and make those decisions. As far as businesses go, much like Rep. Kuppa said, we have been working with our federal counterparts because we do know that at the end of the day, we are going to need some more federal assistance when it comes down to it. And we're facing a massive budget hole, and I don't want to see that burden be put onto our businesses who are trying to rebuild. So we definitely are going to need our federal colleagues to also be a part of this process.
I actually have a question that's really coming from the families. The concerns that going back to school, send the kids back to school, how you make them safe. So the parents do say, okay, if really they don't want to send the kids to school, any options for that?
So there was a council that made a lot of the recommendations for the governor, the Return to Learn Council, and I really liked this council because this council was made up of not just people from Lansing, not just state legislators. This was also made up of school board presidents, of administrators, of teachers, of parents, to make sure everybody's concerns were brought to the table. And a lot of these recommendations were put in there as to how are we going to do this safely. One thing that I think we need to look at, we need to really have a serious conversation about, is what does attendance look like? What do attendance requirements look like? Because if we're telling students, if you're not feeling well, you need to stay home, we shouldn't be holding that against them either, because that's just going to encourage them to come to school. And if they are infected, spread the virus. So I think that we do need to be very flexible with how we're handling attendance and what that looks like.
That's the question. If the parents don't feel comfortable to send their kids to school, do they have a choice of doing that? Just keep the kids at home?
I'd imagine there's going to be a lot of, depending on the local district, a lot of online options, but then we also need to make sure that there is access to broadband and to, the internet for wherever they are, to make sure they can have that type of communication if this is something where they just don't feel safe. The biggest thing I would tell you on that one is making sure that we have broadband access for everybody.
I want to point out two things, and I don't know how you can get this information out. We have a one-pager on what we discovered through our regional roundtables where we listen to everybody. And we created that, and I would love to be able to share that with more business owners that you know. So maybe Representative Koleszar and I can get together afterwards and share that with you. We also sent a letter to Director of Labor and Economic Opportunity on behalf of the Downtown Business Coalition, encouraging Leo to find methods of commercial rent and mortgage relief, because business are renting a space and they're not able to keep their business open. What are they paying the rent for? And so just making sure that we hear from business owners. One of the things that I did was with Senator Chang, we held a town hall with Asian Americans on hate crimes, because I think that's also something to keep in mind. We have leadership at the top of our country that is calling it the Chinese virus and causing havoc and misunderstanding of where the problem is. It's not with people, it's the virus. We shouldn't be fighting each other or blaming anyone. We should really be addressing the issue, the virus together, and we should be working together to defeat this virus. And so making sure that Asian American businesses and Asian Americans populations in general are not afraid and know what bias crimes are, know what hate crimes are, and making sure they have access to that information.
The pandemic has caused some issues with the incidents where people have shown intolerance to Asians based on the origins of the virus. What would you do to offset this instance of intolerance?
And this is something that I have found very troubling. And I know Representative Kuppa actually talked about a few different ideas that we've been speaking about in the legislature. But one thing I can tell you, especially from a local level here, I am very fortunate to represent a district that has people from all over the world in it. And to me, it's important for education and support, being an ally to all those communities. So for example, if there is an Asian event in my district, to attend and promote it, to also know if there is, I know the local libraries here have had the Meet Your Neighbor series, whether it be, I know they had a Meet Your Sikh neighbor, they had Meet Your Muslim neighbor. I think a Meet Your Asian neighbor would also, depending on where it would be, Meet Your Chinese neighbor, Meet Your Japanese neighbor, whoever it may be, meet these people, understand their culture, their customs, and and hopefully make a new friend. Because I think at the end of the day, the reason that people have these views and have been hostile toward Asian Americans is simply because of ignorance. And we need to do what we can to defeat that ignorance.
Do you think there is a systematic racism against Asian Americans?
I think systematic racism exists everywhere in our society, unfortunately. And yes, that includes against Asian Americans. And that goes back to what I said before, that we need to be coming together to defeat that racism. And the best way to do that is through education and interaction.
Rob Kuppa, what are your thoughts on that?
So this is something that's been really important to me. It's one of the reasons that I advocated. I remember telling you that I got involved not only because of after 9/11 and what happened to South Asians as a result of that, but also because of exclusion from an event in Troy because I'm Hindu. And so that is not the promise of America. We are trying to do things to make sure that people of different backgrounds can come together to form relationships, can form coalitions. In fact, not only did I do this before I came to the legislature for years, but also our Democratic caucus has a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative where we have speakers that come and talk about not only systemic inequities, but also to develop understanding across different cultures and to make sure that we are speaking on behalf of our constituents, but also understanding each other and the different communities that we represent. Interestingly, Representative Koleszar and I have communities that are somewhat similar, but I know that my colleague Terry Sabo in Upper Michigan doesn't have the same, and my seatmate Brian Elder, his district is very different. So I think that making sure that we each understand the differences in our district and reaching across the aisle to make sure our colleagues on the other side also understand the diversity of socioeconomic and cultural differences that we have is really important.
There have been some examples of Asian Americans fighting back against what they see as unfair, especially application of affirmative action. How would you address this?
Let me take a chance to try to address this. Lisa, one of the things I've seen is that we pit one issue against another, and we're all trying to fight for the same common good. And I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, not even 2 weeks ago, in the legislature, we had a vote that was very difficult. It was a resolution, which actually has no binding policy. And it was to ensure that Enbridge would be allowed to build a tunnel under the Mackinac Straits. And while the idea of the tunnel is something that the union organizations were backing, the environment groups are very concerned because the organization, the company that was going to build the tunnel, is a Canadian company and is known to not be a good actor. There have been leaks from the existing tunnel. We are not sure that the jobs that they will provide will be labor jobs. This resolution would not bind them to that, but we had to vote, and some of us voted for the union in favor of, because who were objecting, the unions wanted to make sure they could get the jobs, and some of us voted with the environment. And so how do you say which is the right way? First of all, this is a resolution that has no binding policy, no binding law, but we're fighting against each other because we want to protect the environment. We all know the threat of climate change is real, but we had to vote on one side or the other. And so I hear you as far as affirmative action, that it appears that it is unhelpful to Asian Americans in the college admissions process. However, I would say that the entire college admissions process and the entire college funding model has made it so that we don't have a strong middle class anymore. This is one of the things that in 2013, a man by the name of Fareed Zakaria wrote an article in Time magazine called The Thin Envelope Crisis. And it was a year that my older child was graduating high school. And he said, state universities, once the highways of advancement for the middle class, have been utterly transformed under the pressure of rising costs and falling government support. And so this is one of the challenges I think that we need to focus on, because we're not talking only about affirmative action here. We're talking about the lack of investment in education. Why did my parents come here in 1969 and 70 with me as a child? Because this country was famous for the quality of higher education, and it was affordable. Many of my classmates in high school were able to get a college degree without having debilitating debt at the end of it. And so I think that's really what we should talk about, is how do we get more people quality education and making sure that we're fighting on the same side. We may have different aspects, perspectives on the way we view affirmative action, but it's really important that we remember that all of us are fighting for a thinner and thinner slice of the pie. Matt, do you want to add to that?
I think that you hit on the very important issues with this, especially in terms of building a middle class and having a good, affordable education. And I know we're going to be talking a little bit later about vocational technical education as well, which I'll leave it for when we get to that. But I think to that point, that access to education is still very important. And we want to make sure, regardless of who you are, we want to make sure that any community that is not getting a seat at the table, especially in terms of education, has that seat. I think it's very important.
School funding is another issue that is high on the priorities of your voters. Outside of the needs for reopening, what would you do to ensure that our taxes are being spent to promote the best education and not unnecessary agendas?
We need to, first of all, prevent raiding of the school aid fund. And I know Representative Kuppa talked about that just a few minutes ago. We have so often allowed the state to come in and take money from the school aid and divert it elsewhere. We also need to make sure that our kindergarten through 12th aid, or 12th grade, kindergarten through 12th grade has their fund, their portion, the school aid fund, and higher education has their portion. Right now, we basically did it you go back a few years ago, where we basically allowed it to where higher education also took money from the school aid fund away from our kindergarten through 12th grade schools. We need to separate those back out, because unfortunately, as a lot of those costs go up, so does the burden on our school aid fund. So I think if you make sure you're not raiding the school aid fund and making sure that that money goes to schools, that's a very good start.
And I also want to add, again, going back to the formulas and the broken models, do you know when the school aid fund was done? It was the current funding model for schools was done in 1994. It was done 1994-95 when Senator Stabenow was in the state legislature. And it was done around midnight, late night on one evening as a compromise. And they were going to fix it again in a couple of years. Well, it's been 25 years and they haven't allowed us to fix it. So that's really one of the biggest challenges, is that we need to really re-examine what education looks like in the 21st century. I mean, think about 1995. The internet wasn't as robust as it is. There was no social media. There's so many things. There were no iPads. There was no small handheld device that gave you the world at your fingertips. We need to look at school funding and the changes in education. And Rep. Koleszar actually mentioned earlier, statewide broadband. We really need to understand the economic impact of not having statewide broadband right now. It's a huge problem. And so making sure all of those things, in addition to school funding, and getting the funding model right. One of the things that when I came in, I was against privatization and charter schools, because for-profit schools take away money from our children. Many of them just take money until the day that they have to get their attendance right, and then they close the schools down. It's happened so many times across the state where a charter school will get the money and then they'll close their school, and those students will have to go to the local public school because the local public school is required to take that student. And so we really need to stop the waste by stopping giving to to those schools that are not following guidelines, who are not providing a quality education to our children. And we need to fix the situation where a child is coming to school hungry is not going to be able to learn. So we need to address that separately. The school should not be fixing that problem, right? That issue of a child coming to school hungry or with mental health issues or whatever other social issues, those need to be addressed separately. And the child should be able to come to school and learn.
After reopening, there are issues that the state has not properly tackled, and people are looking for clear direction. The first is road quality. Michigan is taxed in the top tier of states, yet we are roughly 40th in actual investment per mile, and our current roads are not where they should be. What would you do to make sure that our tax money is spent to guarantee the improvement we need for safety and business attraction going forward?
So, Lisa, you know I'm an engineer, and I came to this without a whole lot of political background, but I love math. And one of the things that I have been paying attention to is that our state funds roads based on road mile. We do not fund roads based on lane mile. So in Plymouth or Canton or Troy or this Oakland County area, we have 6-lane roads. We're getting the same amount of money because it's based on mileage of the road, not how many lanes there are across. And so somewhere in the Upper Peninsula is getting the same amount of money per road mile as we are. So I think that's part of the problem, is that we're not getting funded equitably. The second problem in math related to roads is that we always take money from one bucket and put it in another bucket because we have a hole, instead of really looking at how do we fix everything, or how do we don't use school funding to plug potholes. I think those are really two important things that we need to be transparent. We need to explain to people. More people need to know about this, because I think that would help start fixing our roads properly, because we have more people here in southeastern Michigan that drive on those roads, which are already not getting the sufficient amount of money to fix them.
And that was a lot of what I was going to talk about too. Our funding model is broken when not just the lanes, as Rep. Kuppa said, but also just think about the sheer amount of traffic that are on the roads here in southeast Michigan, as opposed to a road in rural northern Michigan. We just see there's more cars, there's more heavy trucks, there's a variety of factors, but more populated, bigger roads, but yet same level of funding. That's a problem. In addition to that, we had determined last year that we have got a lot of corporate loopholes in this state, that if we were to close a lot of those corporate loopholes, we could save $800 million that could then be shifted toward the roads. And a lot of these are kind of silly ones, like giving a tax break if a company abides by federal regulations for the environment. Well, that company has to do that anyway. So we're giving somebody a tax break for doing something that were basically for obeying the law. Things like that are just kind of nonsensical when you look at the situation we have on our roads. So I think that that's another thing we need to look at, are closing these corporate loopholes.
Over the last 20, 30 years, the push has been to promote traditional college education, even degrees that will not promise good paying jobs. This has led to a gap in skilled trained workforce. What would you do to help change this perception and fill the work needs gap?
I think if you look back at the last 2 decades, Michigan ranks near the bottom of school funding growth. And as a result, we've seen a narrowing of options. Then we saw a changing of the requirements for basically students to have more of a college preparatory type curriculum. And to your point, yeah, we took away from the trades. I think what we need to do is we need to offer students options for a rich, full curriculum. And what I mean by that is if they want to go the college path, that option is there for them. If they want to go to learn a trade, that option is there for them. We need to make sure that students have a rich, full curriculum where they have options within that curriculum, but also we need to fund it properly. And I am also a proponent of having different incentives for people to go into the trades, whether it be reimbursements for going through trade school or finding a way to make that cost very, very low. Doing things like that to incentivize people to go into these trades, because you can make a lot of money once you get these certifications. And unfortunately, the state hasn't done a very good job of promoting them and doing what we can from our end to incentivize people to go into them.
As you know, Representative Koleszar and I are both Democrats, and we're very fortunate to have a Democratic governor who in her first State of the State address actually announced a new statewide goal to increase the number of Michiganders to make sure that we have a post-secondary credential of 60% by 2030. Michigan is just one of 9 states that had not formally adopted a statewide post-secondary goal attainment, and the association between state income and education levels is very strong. Highly educated states both have some of the best, highest capita incomes in the country. Right now, Michigan ranks 36th for post-secondary educational attainment and 34th for household income. She introduced the Michigan Reconnect and the Michigan Opportunity Scholarship programs to help us reach this goal. The Reconnect is modeled on a successful bipartisan program in Tennessee, and it's a program that would provide a tuition-free pathway to an in-demand industry certificate or an associate degree for Michigan adults. The Michigan Opportunity Scholarship offers 2 paths to help high school seniors who are graduating obtain post-secondary credentials. The first path is to provide a graduating high school student with 2 years of tuition-free post-secondary education at a community college. And it's, again, modeled on a successful program in Tennessee. And the second path is to provide 2 years of tuition assistance at a public or not-for-profit 4-year university for students demonstrating financial need. Right now, those are still in progress, and after this whole thing with the pandemic, I don't know where we're going to find funding for all these things, but those are ideals that we need to strive for and figure out how to pay for them.
Thank you so much for both of you, Rep. Kuppa, Rep. Koleszar, for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.
他们是一群前线英雄，而你可以用一个小举动来报答他们，就是完成2020年人口普查。这些数据可以帮助社区规划，并分配资金给全国各地的医院、诊所和紧急服务。准确计算可以帮助公共卫生局确认所需资源，以保护我们的社区。立即上2020 census.gov 填好问卷，开展我们的未来。即刻上2020 census.gov/languages 回复人口普查。